November 24th, 2011, Charlemagne, Quebec. The river was black, the banks were frozen, and Salvatore Montagna was already dying before his body hit the water. Minutes earlier, gunfire cracked across the edge of the L'Assomption River. A former Bonanno boss from New York, once exiled to Canada, now moving through Montreal's underworld like a claimant to a vacant throne, had been lured into a meeting he would not survive. When police found him, the scene looked simple: a gangland ambush, a score settled in the dark. But the truth was colder than the water around him. Montagna was not killed because he was weak. He was killed because he moved too early in a city that was no longer governed by one Mafia order. Montreal had become a broken kingdom. Vito Rizzuto, the man who once held its factions together through fear, diplomacy, and blood, was gone, imprisoned in the United States. In his absence, alliances shifted. Old grudges resurfaced. Calabrian clans, Sicilian loyalties, biker networks, and foreign-backed crews all began testing the walls. Montagna thought exile had delivered him opportunity. Instead, it dropped him into a power vacuum so violent that one mistake could look like ambition, and ambition could become a death sentence. Vito Rizzuto was not merely a mob boss. He was the product of an imported system. Born in Sicily and raised inside a family already tied to Mafia authority, he inherited more than connections. He inherited a method: quiet leverage, patience, selective violence. In Montreal, that made him dangerous in a way louder men rarely understood. He did not need to dominate every room. He needed others to believe he already controlled what mattered outside it: ports, brokers, political access, street alliances, and the permission structure of the underworld itself. Canadian authorities came to see him as the most powerful Mafia figure in the country, even while American law enforcement often described him in narrower terms through the lens of New York's Bonanno hierarchy. Salvatore Montagna came from the same Sicilian soil, but from a different psychological world. Born in Montreal, raised in Castellamare del Golfo, then hardened in New York, he rose fast inside the Bonanno family and carried the confidence of a man who had already touched the top of an American Mafia regime. He was young for that level of power, hungry, restless. The FBI identified him as the Bonanno acting boss during a turbulent era, and the press branded him the Bambino boss. But exile changed the meaning of status. When he was deported to Canada in 2009 after U.S. immigration authorities moved against him, he arrived with rank in his mind, but without a recognized base beneath his feet. That was the real contrast. Rizzuto represented embedded power. Montagna represented transferable power. One was built into Montreal's machinery. The other believed power could be carried across a border like a title. In Mafia history, that misunderstanding has buried many ambitious men. Montreal did not become Rizzuto territory overnight. It was built through inheritance, war, and negotiation. The old order had been dominated by the Cotroni faction, tied to New York but divided internally by culture, language, and bloodline. The Rizzutos emerged from that fracture as the Sicilian bloc inside a Calabrian structure. When violence tore through the underworld in the late 1970s and Paolo Violi was eliminated, the balance changed. New York shifted its support. The Sicilian faction was no longer subordinate. It was now the center of gravity. That was the foundation Vito stepped into, not chaos, but a system his family had already bled to create. Wikipedia. What made Vito formidable was not just brutality, it was scale. His organization moved beyond neighborhood rackets and into an international architecture of profit: narcotics routes, money laundering, gambling, construction influence, and cross-border alliances. He became a mediator between forces that normally collided: the Mafia, biker organizations, street gangs, and foreign trafficking networks. In public, Montreal looked like a city of contracts, ports, and nightlife. In private, much of that movement passed through channels that required Rizzuto consent. That is how real Mafia power matures, not through spectacle, but through coordination. Montagna rose inside a different machine. In New York, his ascent through the Bonanno family was accelerated by crisis. Federal pressure, imprisoned bosses, and internal instability created space for younger men. He became acting capo-regime, then acting boss, carrying the prestige of one of the five families. By the time he was deported in 2009, he believed that title still meant something in Canada. But Montreal was not waiting for a visiting executive. It already had a ruling class. And men who arrive during uncertainty often mistake vacancy for invitation. The turning point was not a murder, it was an absence. When Vito Rizzuto was extradited to the United States in 2006, then imprisoned after pleading guilty in 2007, Montreal did not simply lose a boss. It lost the one man who could keep incompatible forces in the same room without open war. Under Rizzuto, the city's underworld had functioned through controlled imbalance. Biker networks, street gangs, international traffickers, and Mafia factions all understood the limits. Once he was gone, those limits became negotiable. And in organized crime, anything negotiable eventually becomes violent. The first signs were not subtle. In December 2009, Vito's son, Niccolo Rizzuto Jr., was shot dead in broad daylight. Months later, Paolo Renda disappeared. Then, Agostino Contreras, regarded as a major loyalist and possible successor, was killed. In November 2010, the deepest wound landed. Niccolo Rizzuto, the old patriarch, was murdered by sniper fire while eating dinner in his home. These were not random blows. They were strategic removals. Piece by piece, the structure around the Rizzuto name was being dismantled, while its central figure sat in an American prison cell, unable to answer force with force. That was the moment Sal Montagna misread history as opportunity. He saw funerals, disappearances, and a weakened Sicilian regime. He believed the throne was unguarded, so he moved into the vacuum alongside figures like Reynald Desjardins and Joe DeMallo, trying to convert instability into authority. But a vacuum inside the Mafia is never empty. It is crowded with men pretending patience while calculating murder. By this stage, the feud was no longer just a Mafia dispute. Governments had entered the story, and not by accident. Vito Rizzuto had been removed through an American prosecution tied to the 1981 murders of 3 Bonanno captains, then physically cut out of Montreal by extradition and prison. Sal Montagna arrived through a different state mechanism, but with the same effect. He was not driven north by defeat in a street war. He was pushed across the border by immigration law after a contempt conviction gave U.S. authorities the leverage to strip his status and send him back to Canada. One man was extracted by racketeering law, the other was repositioned by deportation law. Together, those decisions rearranged the map of organized crime in Montreal. That is what made the violence political. The state did not destroy the underworld. It destabilized the chain of command. The Rizzuto system had been tied not only to narcotics routes and transnational mafia alliances, but also to the practical economy of the city itself: construction influence, public contracts, and corrupt access. Testimony at Quebec's corruption inquiry pointed to the depth of that reach. So when Vito disappeared, the struggle was not merely over gambling and loan sharking. It was over who would inherit a criminal structure woven into commerce, municipal influence, and cross-border trafficking. And while the Sicilian regime weakened, rival forces tested the perimeter. At the Quebec inquiry, an RCMP analyst observed that an Ontario-based Ndrangheta faction was believed to have taken over ground once dominated by the Rizzutos. That meant the feud had escalated beyond personality. It had become a contest between systems: New York prestige, Sicilian legacy, Calabrian expansion, and a state apparatus that kept removing key men without controlling what came after. In that kind of pressure chamber, betrayal stops being a possibility. It becomes policy. By 2011, Montagna was no longer an outsider looking for entry. He was a claimant, behaving like a boss before the city had agreed to one. Police believed he had become increasingly active, trying to fill the void created by arrests, kidnappings, and murders. He was linked to efforts to impose himself on Montreal's rackets, including allegations that he pressured construction companies for a percentage of their profits. That mattered because construction was never just revenue. In Montreal, it was influence. To touch that sphere without a settled coalition was to declare intent in the clearest possible language. At first, Montagna moved through partnership. He aligned himself with Reynald Desjardins and Joseph Di Mallo, and together they tried to build consensus over who would control the post-Rizzuto order. But mafia alliances formed inside a vacuum are usually temporary. They are bridges built over suspicion. Soon, the arrangement began to rot from the inside. Montagna and Desjardins reportedly fell into conflict over loan sharking and bookmaking, old rackets but crucial ones, because whoever controlled them controlled daily obedience, neighborhood revenue, and the rhythm of the street. Then came the signal that private disagreement had become blood feud. In September 2011, an attempt was made on Desjardins' life in Laval. He survived. After that, trust was finished. Montagna had already arrived in Montreal without recognized standing inside the Rizzuto system. Once Desjardins turned from ally to enemy, he lost the one protection that matters in organized crime: proximity to men who still fear killing you. On the morning of November 24, 2011, the feud reached its final sentence. Salvatore Montagna was drawn into a meeting near the L'Assomption River, on the edge of Charlemagne and Ile-Vaudrey, east of Montreal. What exactly was promised that morning remains buried inside the logic of underworld diplomacy. But mafia killings of this kind are rarely spontaneous. They happen after a man has already been judged, after alliances fail, after the last useful conversation is over. By then, Montagna was no longer negotiating from strength. He had quarreled with Reynald Desjardins over control of loan sharking and bookmaking. An attempt had already been made on Desjardins' life 2 months earlier. The message was clear. This conflict had moved beyond mediation and into elimination. Witnesses reported hearing gunfire around 10 a.m. Police later established 2 related scenes, one in Charlemagne, the other across the narrow, frigid water near Ile-Vaudrey. Investigators believed Montagna was shot on one side and then entered the river in a desperate attempt to escape. He made it across, but he did not make it out alive. He was found on the shoreline, and despite emergency efforts, he was pronounced dead soon after. The image was brutal in its simplicity. A former Bonanno boss, once discussed as a successor in New York, reduced to a body at the edge of frozen water in suburban Quebec. Mafia language, the killing meant more than death. It meant invalidation. Montagna had tried to convert exile into command. He had tried to step into a city whose hierarchy had been wounded, but not erased. His murder announced that the coalition around him was finished, that his claim had been rejected, and that private ambition without stable protection was now punishable by public removal. This was not simply revenge. It was administrative violence, a reordering. Montreal's underworld was declaring, in the oldest way it knew, that succession would not belong to the man bold enough to reach for it first. It would belong to the men who survived long enough to decide who had overreached. Montagna's death did not end the feud. It clarified it. His murder told Montreal that the post-Rizzuto transition had failed. The coalition that had tried to manage succession from the outside was broken, and anyone who had mistaken temporary access for permanent authority was now exposed. Montagna had arrived as a deported Bonanno leader with ambition, but he died as proof that imported rank meant little without local obedience. In mafia politics, that distinction is fatal. Then, less than a year later, Vito Rizzuto came home. When he returned to Canada on October 5, 2012, he stepped back into a city where his family had been decimated, his son murdered, his father assassinated, his inner circle shattered, his empire described as weakened and under attack. But return itself was a message. It meant the original regime had not accepted replacement. And soon, the answer came in bodies. Men linked to the anti-Rizzuto camp or to rival alignments began to fall. Joe Di Mallo was executed, Giuseppe De Vito died by poisoning in prison, and other figures tied to the struggle were killed in a widening campaign widely seen as retaliation and reconsolidation. But the old order never fully returned. Even vengeance could not restore the architecture that prison, extradition, and internal war had broken. Montreal's underworld survived. Its stability did not. In the end, the story of Vito Rizzuto and Sal Montagna was never just about two men. It was about what happens when organized crime loses the illusion of order. From the outside, the Mafia sells a myth of hierarchy: bosses, captains, codes, permission, discipline. It presents itself as an alternative government, ruthless but stable, predictable in its own dark way. But Montreal revealed the lie beneath that image. The system looked strongest when one man could absorb every contradiction around him. Once Vito was removed by extradition and prison, the structure did not hold. It splintered. The murders of his son, his father, his allies, and the open contest that followed showed that Mafia peace is often nothing more than delayed violence managed by a credible threat. Montagna understood power as title. That was his fatal mistake. He came from New York carrying the prestige of the Bonanno family, believing that status could travel with him across the border. But criminal power is not a passport. It is local. It depends on memory, debt, bloodlines, and the silent agreements of men who may already be planning your funeral. Montreal did not reject Montagna because he lacked ambition. It rejected him because ambition without rooted legitimacy becomes a threat to every existing arrangement. In the underworld, that kind of threat is rarely debated for long. It is isolated, cornered, and removed. And yet Rizzuto's return proved something equally grim. Even the man who had once held the factions together could not truly restore what had been broken. Yes, his return triggered fear. Yes, rivals and defectors began to die. But revenge is not reconstruction. It is only memory armed with a gun. By the time he came back, the city had changed. Other forces had moved in. Other loyalties had hardened. Law enforcement pressure, transnational alliances, corruption inquiries, Calabrian encroachment, and years of killings had already rewritten Montreal's criminal map. The old regime could strike back, but it could not return to innocence, not that it had ever possessed any. So the river at Charlemagne becomes more than a murder scene. It becomes the perfect ending to a Mafia era. A man runs through cold water, believing he can still survive the consequences of moving too early in a city at war with itself. He reaches the other side, but history is already there waiting for him. That is the truth this feud leaves behind. Organized crime does not collapse when its rulers fall. It fragments. And fragmentation can be more savage than rule, because no one is enforcing peace anymore, only claiming the right to inherit it. Montreal learned that in gunfire, disappearances, and funerals. Montagna learned it in the last minutes of his life. And Vito Rizzuto, perhaps more than anyone, learned that an empire built on fear can survive many enemies, but it rarely survives absence.